The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, and thank you, everyone, for joining us for another Learning Lunch hosted by Formed Approved. My name is Wendy Whitmore. I'm the Chief Information and Learning Officer with Formed, and I'm joined today by Formed Approved Senior Director of Online Education and all things security at Formed, Mr. Brian Johnson. Hi, Brian.
Hello, everyone.
Today's Learning Lunch is entitled Protecting Healthcare Consumer Payment Information, and we selected this title today because it is the holidays, and around the holidays we find that there are many, many more breach reports happening. There's a much higher incidence of potential consumer payment breach, and we thought this was a good time of year for us to talk about this topic. We also happen to have a mini workshop that we are presenting for the very same reason next week, and we hope we'll give you some more information about that workshop as we go here today, but that can help with understanding PCI regulations which are related to consumer payment information. Remember that you can ask questions of our presenter at any time during today's session by entering them into the chat area. In the second half of the presentation, we will address as many questions as we have time for, and if we do run out of time, answers to all submitted questions will be posted to our website and sent via email link later in the week. Also, remember that all registered attendees of today's session will receive an email with links to both the slides and the recorded version of the event. Everybody seems to ask us that along the way, so please know that you will receive that. And again, if we have limited time, we will take all of your submitted questions and make sure you get answers to them. So feel free to pop those into the chat box as we present. Again, my name is Wendy Whitmore. I am the Chief Information and Learning Officer at Formed, and I have with me Brian Johnson. Brian has extensive experience in healthcare compliance. He works with our security compliance partner program and has a long history in education, training, and publishing as well. So Brian is a good person to speak on this topic, and we thought we would do a nice brief interview to cover various aspects of the payment card industry and kind of how you can manage that throughout the holiday season today. So Brian, payment cards are regulated a little different than HIPAA. Most of our webinars from a security standpoint are dealing with the topic of HIPAA regulations and HIPAA security. But PCI-DSS is a little different. Talk to me a little bit about what that stands for and why it's important.
Sure. So first of all, what it stands for, as you can see on the slide there, is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And that suggests the main difference between PCI-DSS and HIPAA, which is HIPAA is federal legislation. You know, this is federal law. It's usually handled as a matter of civil law, but it is something that you can face criminal charges for, whereas PCI-DSS is an industry requirement. It's not a legal requirement. But anyone who takes payment cards, and I should say the reason why we're speaking of payment cards instead of credit cards is that this includes both credit cards and debit cards. So any of those cards that you have a magnetic strip that you might use at the store are included in this regulation. Anyone who takes those cards or sorry, it sounds like we're getting a little bit of interference. Anyhow, anyone who takes or uses those cards is required to follow these regulations. And the reason why they exist is that they were set up by the industry after a number of breaches that occurred. Now, if you follow the breach news at all, and we'll talk more about this later, I'm sure you've heard about, you know, the Target breach and the Home Depot breach, these big breaches, but there were big breaches happening even in the past, and so the major credit card companies came together and formed the PCI Council and set up the first set of standards in 2004. So that's where all this comes from. And the reason why you need to be aware of it is that if you're in any way involved in taking payment cards, you're subject to these requirements.
Right, and you know, I think again people tend to confuse what the or assume, I should say, that HIPAA somehow covers them as it relates to breach information that is connected to payment cards, and there is a certain amount of overlap, correct?
Yes, yeah. And we'll get to that here in a minute, but yes, absolutely.
There you go. So tell me, how are those PCI regulations in in some way related to HIPAA?
Well, they're very similar because, and where they're most similar is that, you know, HIPAA these days has a lot to do with protecting digital information, with protecting patient data. And PCI regulations there's a lot of overlap because they're focused on protecting consumer data. And so as a result, there's many overlapping requirements that are basically just good practices to use for maintaining network security and the confidentiality of information. So to give an example, both requirements require you to designate a compliance officer, for example. So no matter whether you're a small practice or a large organization, you've got to have someone who is in charge of your security, and that is a way of ensuring that all of the compliance, you know, that there's someone actually in charge and acting as a champion to make sure that everything is done properly. They both require annual training, which is, I think, an interesting overlap. So, you know, HIPAA, anyone who comes into contact with protected health information, no matter how incidentally they come into contact with it, they have to have HIPAA training on an annual basis. And the training should include not just what the law says, but also what the organization's policies are. And the policies are the way that the organization then meets the requirements of the law. So that's HIPAA, but PCI is the same way. Anyone who has access to credit card information needs to understand the basic rules set up by PCI-DSS around credit cards, but they also need to understand their organization's policies about it. Now, when it comes to something like passwords, that's an interesting example because it illustrates how the requirements overlap, but there's some differences too. So the security rule of HIPAA requires that anyone who has access to electronic PHI, there has to be some kind of password or PIN in place. But it says nothing about what the password or PIN has to look like. And that's the way HIPAA is in general. It's very vague, some people would say, or very general would be another way to put it. And the reason why is they don't want to update the regulations every year as technology changes. And they know that the regulations apply to many different types of organizations, especially now that business associates are included. Where PCI comes along, the requirements are much more specific. They say that the password has to be 8 digits or longer. It has to include a mix of numbers and letters. It has to include a capital letter. It has to include a symbol. Now, this is just good password practice. Anyone who, you know, is out there on the internet and has accounts that they access, your password should meet those conditions, and you should change your password on a regular basis. The difference is that PCI forces you to use good password security. HIPAA, technically, you know, if you put your phone number in as your password, you're meeting the HIPAA requirement, whereas in PCI-DSS, you're not. And finally, just as a last overlap that I think is important to note, because it comes up in some of the breaches, is they both require you to track system activity. And so that means whatever's going on in your computers, there needs to be a log that keeps track of what's happening. So HIPAA requires that. It's called the System Activity Review. You've got to be able to tell which user has accessed which health record at what time, et cetera. And EHRs generally do this. It's included as an automatic part of the system now. But as an administrative requirement, you've got to actually review that stuff. PCI-DSS is the same way. And I mention that because one of the things that happened with the Target breach we've all heard so much about, Target had this very sophisticated security software in place, but they ignored the security alerts that malware was stealing credit cards. Now, you know, you think, how could they possibly ignore that? Well, the problem, from what I've seen, the accounts of it that I've read, is that they had an older system in place that sent them hundreds of alerts every day. And so they got alert fatigue, where you just see an alert and you turn it off, see an alert, turn it off. And you just start to ignore these things. And so then they didn't notice that there was actually some alerts that were flashing red saying, my God, the whole thing's coming apart at the seams here. We've got to do something immediately. They ignored those too, and that's how they breached, you know, tens of millions of credit cards.
Right, and you know, one of the things is I did write an article about this earlier in the week, and you know, people often ask, why, if we have HIPAA, do we also have to pay attention to PCI regulations? Well, all of those reasons are good in terms of understanding why there are some differences where those additional regulatory issues are addressed.
And that's why you need a compliance officer, too. You need somebody who can sort through and figure out, well, this is what we've got to do. And in our security courses, we talk about this. If you have to do a certain password to satisfy PCI, then you should follow that policy for HIPAA because you kill two birds with one stone then.
Right. And one of the reasons, again, that we decided to address this topic today, in addition to the fact that, it's a busy time of year for potential breach activity, is that, as the payment card industry becomes more and more integral to electronic health records and to billing processes for hospitals and healthcare environments, as we move to a more consumer-based payment focus for healthcare services, in other words, the co-payments become a much bigger component of what's happening in the current healthcare payment systems. And paying with healthcare savings accounts with payment cards is happening more often. As that becomes more true in the industry, understanding how to protect the information connected to those payment cards becomes more and more important as well. So, and every time I start talking about something, I realize it pops right up on the slide. But what?
Well, it's a natural progression.
It is. So, in terms of consumer payment information, why has it become, and obviously I just mentioned a couple of reasons, but why is it becoming more important in healthcare practice?
Well, so there is very much the point that you just mentioned, which is you could call it the consumerization of healthcare and the increasing use of payment cards in healthcare, but it's also been a growing source of concern, essentially, that healthcare information is especially valuable to hackers. And there's lots of information we have now that shows us this is the case. So, the FBI tells us that healthcare on these black markets where they sell personal information from people, healthcare data sells for 5 to 20 times as much as just a simple credit card number would sell for. And the reason why is that when you've got that PHI in play, that protected health information, it gives you a lot more information to use for identity theft. So people will take credit card numbers and use them to make fraudulent charges, but that's a kind of a one-off thing. Once they use the card, it usually doesn't take very long for the bank to figure out it's been stolen. A lot of the times, the stolen cards are not even usable. So 60 Minutes had a thing on the Target breach this last Sunday, and they said that only about 5% of the cards were actually ever used for fraudulent charges because the bank shut down the rest before they could be used. So there's limited value in those cards. But if you combine that with information that you can use for identity theft, you've got a lot more lucrative pool of information. And how this all circles back is that healthcare is not doing a very good job, unfortunately, of protecting this data that patients entrust to their providers. So the FBI issued these things they call private industry notification. And the idea is that they're confidential, but of course they always leak and everybody talks about them. So they issued one in April where they said to healthcare providers, look, you guys have the most valuable data of any industry. You have a lot more information on people than a retailer typically has. And yet you lag badly behind other sectors in protecting that information. And so there's a lot of effort by both the banks and the government to try to get healthcare providers to take digital security more seriously because they're really vulnerable to being hacked. And we're just going to see more and more breaches that involve healthcare providers.
Well, the other thing that I read when I was writing that article was that, not only is healthcare in general doing a bad job of protecting information, but in terms of the payment card industry, they're very unsophisticated in terms of how they go about. Again, this is partly because I think they really haven't focused on the payment card situation over the course of the healthcare community, or in the healthcare community as much, and thus, where the breach is happening in retail, and retail is becoming a lot more sophisticated, healthcare is kind of behind the curve, as they have been in technology in general.
Right.
And so, when you're behind the curve, then the hackers see you as an opportune target.
Absolutely, that's a great point. For a lot of healthcare providers, they may have been, up until recently, just using little dummy terminals to do their transactions, whereas now everything is through, web portals, and it's just a different world. Yeah. The vulnerabilities are much higher.
Absolutely. So if a hacker does get into the payment card system, what kind of information can they grab from a healthcare provider?
Well, we've already covered a lot of this, but, that's why that data is so valuable, is that you've got everything from the name, the address, the birth date. You very often have the social security number in that record, although these days I question whether providers should really take SSNs. You've got phone numbers, email addresses, driver's license numbers. You will have biometric data, so that could be, sometimes it's a highfalutin thing, but you can have just a photograph of a person can be useful if you're trying to do identity theft, and that's almost always in an EHR.
Right.
So all of these things under federal regulations count as what are called identifiers. And so those identifiers, if a record contains any one of those things, and it can be a very fragmentary type of information, then that record becomes protected health information, and it's subject to federal protection. So that means that if you breach that information, the government's going to investigate you. You face fines. If it's a big breach, you have to report it to the media. You're embarrassed. You have all this damage to your reputation, and so on and so forth. But then on top of all that, providers now are processing millions upon millions of payment card transactions every year. And so you've got, vulnerabilities on both sides of it then, because the same malware, and, malware is just malicious software like a Trojan horse or something like that, the same malware that's hit retailers like Home Depot could absolutely go into a healthcare system in the same way. The Home Depot breach, the way that whole thing started, was through vendors. And it's often the case that you've got vendors involved. So, or look at the Target situation. It was a heating company that got a phishing email. The phishing email infected their systems with malware, stole passwords, and probably the people who hit that heating, that HVAC company, weren't trying to get into Target originally. They were just sending out phishing emails. They blast these things out. But then they realized that they could get into Target through that company, and that's how the breach happened. Well, think about providers and their business associates. Business associates that handle billing and things like that, they have the same kind of access to healthcare systems that HVAC company had. And so there's that same kind of interdependence where, if one company is vulnerable, they can then become the gateway through which the other company gets attacked. And so all of this is stuff that providers need to really come up to date on and be aware of the fact that there's people out there who are trying to actively attack systems every day, and healthcare providers are just as vulnerable as everyone else, if not more vulnerable.
If not more so. Again, because the hackers know that the level of sophistication and protection is not high.
Right.
One. And then two, that if they do get hold of that information, there's a good chance that they can get more valuable information through that healthcare provider. So
Absolutely.
I think they're more vulnerable in many cases. So, kind of going back to the second slide and talking about the overlapping, concepts. Let's open that up a little bit more.
Slide, actually.
Well, and we can talk a little bit more about this too. Again, I think one of the issues around the fact that PCI and HIPAA, intersect is that, the requirements are potentially similar, but not quite identical. One of the things that we did want to talk about a little bit, more, is how, as you mentioned, the penalties differ. So in HIPAA, there's a criminal penalty aspect.
Right.
There's jail time potentially, but PCI is really kind of consumer protection driven and is definitely more civil penalty oriented.
Well, and it comes from the industry. So the industry itself will subject a merchant, for example, to fines. And the penalties, and I think we talk about this more a little bit later in the presentation too, but the penalties go all the way up to, they can take away your right to process payment cards, which would destroy essentially any business these days. I mean, if you're a cash-only business, you're probably,
in healthcare, yeah.
You're not going to survive.
No.
So if that were to happen, I mean, that would be the end of your business. But even if they didn't go that far, I mean, the fines that they can levy against you are considerable. And there's also, of course, the civil lawsuits you're going to face for this sort of thing. The target litigation, I read an update about it the other day. Here we are, it's a year later, essentially, and that litigation has essentially just begun. But it is going to cost that company billions of dollars. The banks are suing them. Consumers are suing them. It's a disaster, and nobody wants to be in that position.
And they've had to invest in, like, identity protection.
They spent, in the first 2 months after that breach, they spent $60 million just to try to sort out the consumer protection part of it.
Right.
So, I mean, now they're a large organization. Most providers are not as large as Target is, but there are some that are of similar scale. Right. And if you're smaller, maybe you would only have to pay $10 million.
Right.
So $10 million is devastating, would devastate most providers.
Oh, yeah. And even in small provider environments, I think what you said is most critical, which is if their fine or their penalty is to lose access to billing privileges and credit cards, you got to shut down.
Yeah, that's the end of the game.
What are you going to do? So who in the healthcare environment should be responsible for this? Obviously, we talked about there being a compliance officer on the site. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you've got to have a compliance officer, and that's something you got to do for HIPAA, but you got to do it for PCI-DSS too. And I think, the points here on the slide show why the compliance officer is so important. So, for example, we talked about the fact that they are the person who's got to figure out HIPAA and PCI-DSS, but there's other regulations that usually apply. So 47 of 50 states now have some kind of healthcare privacy law that's apart from HIPAA, so almost all of them, and you need to figure out what your state law is. Also, some states have laws that apply to any patient who lives in that state, whether you're there or not. So, for example, Nevada has a very strict data security law, and if any of your patients live in Nevada, you're subject to Nevada law and have to meet all of its requirements. So that's something that a compliance officer can help you figure out. That's part of their job. But a major part of what they are there for is to make sure that you've got proper policies and procedures in place that help you meet the law and its requirements, along with the PCI requirements, and that they're actually followed.
And kept up to date.
And kept up to date. So that's a training piece of it. You need to make sure that everyone in that organization gets their training annually, because if you ever get into trouble and you haven't met your training requirements, you've lost the investigation right there. Right. And that's something that, is easy to lose track of, and a compliance officer can use tools that are available online to keep track of that information now. And they also would be responsible for building an awareness program. And so training is part of that, but events like this learning lunch can be part of awareness. Awareness can include simple things like posters, on the wall that say, these are the rules for credit cards. You can't do this or that. Those things just help to remind people that doing things like writing down somebody's credit card on a Post-it note and then keeping that note is a violation of PCI-DSS and is not the proper way to protect their information.
Right. And so a couple of tips and hints. I mean, obviously, this is not a certification course today, but, what can providers do and what can consumers do to limit potential for a breach?
Well, the first thing is that they need to conduct a risk analysis.
Right.
And that is the first requirement of the HIPAA security rule.
Well, I heard that a lot of payment card companies are requiring, so before they'll even set you up, to be able to collect payments using credit cards, they're going to require that you do a risk analysis now.
Absolutely. So you need to do it for PCI as well. And so again, it's where there's this overlap between them. And when it comes to the digital security requirements of PCI and HIPAA, they're essentially the same. And so, you know, a risk analysis for HIPAA is going to involve all these questions about HIPAA that have nothing to do with PCI. But then the digital security part of it is essentially the same. And so part of that is that you need to conduct network scanning, and that just means that you use a tool that looks for vulnerabilities in your computer network and then gives you a pathway. There needs to be a report that tells you how you can close those vulnerabilities. Now, the best way to do network scanning is called continuous monitoring. And I think that there's more and more companies that are adopting that. It's important to note that for the largest organizations, one thing, you know, this isn't formal training on PCI, but there's these different levels of PCI compliance. So the bigger you are in terms of the more credit cards you take, you have to do more things. And at the top level, you have to do continuous monitoring. And one of the controversies around the Home Depot breach, for example, is that former employees claimed that they were basically exploiting a loophole and that they weren't doing the continuous monitoring that they were required to do. Now, the company disputes that and says they were doing it, but the message here is that if they had been doing regular scanning of all of their network, they would have detected that malware before it ran off with more than 50 million credit card numbers.
Right.
So that is something that healthcare providers need to consider, and I think, you know, in 10 years, I honestly think people will think it's bizarre that we weren't doing continuous monitoring. I think it'll just become part of the landscape, and everyone will continuously monitor their network for malicious activity. And then finally, you know, you've got to conduct training again. You've got to follow the procedures if you want to prevent breaches. Breaches are how you're going to get in trouble with whether it's HIPAA or PCI. Once that data gets out, you're in big trouble.
Yeah, and to actually dial back a little bit on this slide, kind of understanding that how the industry has changed so dramatically is that, you know, once upon a time, not that long ago, when you took somebody's credit card and you were scanning that credit card, that information was really going directly to the bank.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't happen in the same way anymore, particularly in, you know, a medical office environment where the billing and the credit card is all connected to the practice management software and things like that. Now, all of a sudden, when you scan that credit card, it's sitting in your network. It's going across the transom. It's landing, you know. So there's a lot of pathways for that data that weren't there before. And that's where the protection, the levels of protection and the need for levels of protection has really changed.
Yeah, and it's the interconnectedness of everything that's really the problem here, is because you've got, you know, if you're using one of those terminals that we're all familiar with, those terminals are typically isolated. It would depend on the circumstances of the business. But when you're using more integrated systems, if anything gets into your network anyway, then it can get to those credit card machines. And that's what happened with Target. The malware that got into their system didn't start by getting to the credit card terminals. It started elsewhere in the network and then spilled into that area. And so, you know, again, if you've got someone at the front desk who opens a phishing email, the malware can go from their computer into the network, into your health records, and then it's transmitting data to the Ukraine or someplace like that, and you're going to get in trouble.
Right. And again, you know, we have interconnected everything for convenience purposes. We did it to make things better.
Right.
Right? But, of course, what we've done is we've made it more vulnerable as a result.
Absolutely.
Because there's way more pathways.
Yeah, so it's a good thing that everything is connected, but the corollary of that is that you've got to have proper digital security.
Right, and I try to explain to people, it's like if you own a house and you've got one door to your house and only one door, and you've got excellent locks on that door, the likelihood that somebody's going to break into your house are low. But, you know, nobody wants to just have a brick, you know, four-walled house with a single door. So we've got windows, and we've got more than one door. We've got sliding glass doors and all those other things, which are lovely, but that also opens up a lot more penetration opportunities.
And the unfortunate thing, it's a great metaphor, the unfortunate thing is, all it takes is one unlocked window that somebody gets in, and then it doesn't matter that everything else is locked because they're inside.
That is correct. And that's the same in terms of protecting data as well. So on the consumer side in healthcare services, what can the consumers do? What do we, how can we make recommendations to the consumer community as consultants, as providers, to help them protect their own data?
Right. Well, consumers are not subject to PCI-DSS because they are not processing cards. They have cards, but still, there's just practices that everyone should become aware of over time, I think. And so one of the things you want to never do is never send a credit card number. The number on the front of a credit card is called a PAN. Never send that number by email or text or chat.
Certainly not in combination with an expiration date or a security code, because that's the other thing too, is the nice thing that the credit card companies have done to date, and they're actually improving upon this, is that they've created multiple codes and connectivity to validation. So I know for our company, when we validate a credit card, if the billing zip code doesn't match and the expiration code doesn't match, it's not going to process. And so, but I have actually seen people try to send us, in order to make a payment for something, try to send us their number and their expiration, and they're all in an email to us. And we've been very careful to warn them not to do that.
Yeah, then we delete that material. But the thing you've got to be aware of is that those communications are typically not encrypted, so it's really easy to eavesdrop. If you're on a Wi-Fi network, it's really easy for people to get that information. And you can't really get rid of it after you send it. So if you send a text, for example, that has your credit card information in it, you can delete that text from your phone, but the phone company has it forever. And anyone who overheard that information, who is eavesdropping on you electronically, they've got it. And so you should just never do that. Consumers need to demand that the people that they entrust with their information take security seriously. And so,
well, that's been surprising to me. So I read some articles about the holiday shopping and about the fact that people are still just swiping their cards, as always at Target with no, not making sure that they've got special PIN codes, not changing their passwords, not anything. And then it is interesting to me that the consumers make the assumption. So that's something as a provider, as a consultant, as a IT, support person to note, is that the consumers, as much as we're going to tell you in the slide that we would love it if the consumers are paying attention and protecting their own information, really they don't by and large. So if you're not doing it, if on the payment collection side you're not doing it, then you end up responsible for the fact that they're not.
Unfortunately, you're typically going to take the blame for that, as the merchant, and the merchant in this case would be the healthcare provider. So, there are consequences for consumers too. They're generally protected from credit card fraudulent charges. That's typically not the case with debit cards. There's usually a cap, but, so consumers can lose money through those things. And if there's identity theft, that can be a nightmare for people. That can be a nightmare for people. And, I'll just volunteer that my mother had a situation like that. And it took, I think, 9 months of letters to clear it up. So it's really a big hassle for people.
Absolutely. And the bottom bullet there, responsibility to use strong password. Again, when you're setting up your website, when you're setting, that's another piece too. You have the opportunity to say on the provider side, to say, in order for me to run this transaction through my website, or for me, for you to place an order through whatever it is, if you have the opportunity to set that security level higher, and the higher you set it, the more aligned with PCI-DSS regulations that you are, the more likely that you're protecting that payment card.
And it's nice that a lot of websites now, when people set, and you may have noticed this, when you set your password, it'll tell you whether your password's any good or not. And if it tells you you've got a weak password, you shouldn't use that.
You shouldn't use that. But you also shouldn't allow your, your website visitors, if they're paying via your patient portal for a co-payment, or if they're, processing an order of a post-surgical equipment or something like that on your website, if you've got that password set to be, 4 digits and spell something, that's probably not going to fall in line with these PCI-DSS regulations.
And just as a quick aside, the reason why that's so important is, if you remember the scandal a few months ago where people went into celebrities' Apple accounts and took new photos and sent them out to the world. From all accounts, that wasn't really Apple's fault. And that's certainly what they claim. They say they were not hacked. What it appears happened is that people guessed their passwords because the celebrities used passwords that were relatively easy to guess.
Right.
And so if you do that, you're just asking for trouble. And so, I mean, of course, what happened to the celebrities is unfortunate because those were private communications with loved ones. But still, that is what can happen if you don't have good password practices.
So one of the components that you have mentioned several times, and not surprisingly since we are coming from the perspective of a training company and we are very high on the requirement of training in many of these cases, partly because it does help people stay aware of what they need to know around these important regulatory issues. But, from a compliance officer standpoint, for instance, and also a frontline kind of front defense person standpoint, why is training on credit card security important? What does it do? How does it help it?
Yeah, well, we've touched on a lot of this already, but the training is really the way you're going to prevent breaches more than anything else. You've got to have that network scanning, but if you train people on good email practices, for example, then they're not as vulnerable to phishing attacks. A phishing email is an email that invites you to click on a link or click on an attachment, and then when you do that, it infects your computer with malware. Well, part of the way you defend against that is technological, but an important part of it is training, is that your staff needs to know that if they get an email from an unfamiliar source that has a link in it, they should never click on that link because that is how they can get infected. And so everyone understanding that, your staff understanding that they have to protect those PANs, those numbers on the front of the card, that is another element of how you can prevent a breach and protect yourself from getting into trouble with the payment card industry. But I want to add something to this because we've touched on a lot of this already, but it's something that I think is important, and that's that protecting patient data, in my opinion, is an important part of patient care. And what I mean by that is sometimes providers, they're understandably focused on clinical outcomes. They want their patients to be healthy. They are, people who have trained for years to be medical professionals. And so digital security is not necessarily at the center of their concerns. But it is important from the patient care perspective because patients are trusting you with this data. And, we know, for example, that stress is one of the worst things that can happen from a health perspective. And the stress of having your identity stolen can be tremendous. So, if you are the reason why a patient's identity is stolen, you've impacted their health, certainly their mental health, by allowing that to happen.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but that is a good point. Yeah.
And so I just think, there's the do no harm principle, and very much, if you're not protecting data, you're allowing harm to happen to that patient. And so it is something, it's not at the core of medicine, but it is something that providers need to take seriously.
Agreed. And we talked about the compliance officer versus kind of the frontline employee. When you are annually training these people to understand how to protect payment information, just a little...
Yeah, just real quick, the compliance officer needs more detailed training, although even that doesn't need to be, terribly long. Like for HIPAA, it can be, 6 to 8 hours. For PCI-DSS, 2 or 3, 4 hours. There's different training out there. Can meet those requirements. But the good news is for members of the workforce, they don't need training of that length. For payment card training.
It's part of the best practices, I think.
Absolutely. And, we're talking about an hour or less. And it's not complicated. It's basic stuff that everyone who handles credit cards needs to understand. And so it should be affordable, and it should be relatively brief. It's something you do once a year, and then after that, you just, the compliance officer, just make sure that everybody's following the rules.
Right, and the compliance officer, a lot of the level of training that they're going to deal with will have to do with how to protect those networks, how to deal with network training, those kinds of things that are going to be, related to some of the IT regulatory issues and things like that. Whereas the front desk person, really, it's a bunch of best practices.
Yeah.
How to avoid, you know.
Don't get hit by a phishing email.
Those kinds of things, exactly, which is true of the different levels of HIPAA training as well. So anyway, that concludes our little summary session today. So you know, our various training programs do include training as it relates to PCI-DSS regulations. We have both levels of training available. Next week, we happen to be running a 1-hour accelerated certificate program, very inexpensive, where you know, all frontline staff can take a brief 1-hour session and get a certificate of proficiency in terms of credit card security protection for that year. And we have a 20% discount there if you go to formedworkshops.com and use Learning20 as a discount code for that course. You can take 20% off that. You can always.
When the slides come, I just mentioned that link will take you. You know, if you want to do it right now, you can go to Formed Workshops. It's the top one. Use that discount code. When we send out the slides after this event, if you just click on the link, it'll take you directly to the workshop with the discount code already put in for you. So look for the slides after this event. We
also have a self-paced version of the course that we've just recently redesigned and updated that's available as well at formedtraining.com and has a link there. And then our learning lunches, as you know, are always free. We do try to touch on as many important aspects of a topic as we can in each one of these free sessions. And you can always find those on our homepage by clicking on the Learning Lunch button or by just going to formedlearning.com. So thank you, Brian, for this presentation today. We appreciate it. And we hope that everybody will take a look at potentially getting their staff trained up on the topics of payment card industry regulations at either the compliance officer level or the workforce level. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.